everyone. Welcome to Bungkus today. So today we're gonna have Sandy who's gonna talk about Startup PR 101. So yeah, she's gonna talk about what type of PR strategy that is like great for your startups. And I want to tell you about the events that we're going to have this week. So for today we still have another event that is happening. Actually, it will be happening at Alaya Resort Jimbawan. So the name of the event is Fuck Up. I don't know if you guys haven't heard about this, but this up night we're gonna invite 4 speakers who gonna talk about their fuck up and basically about their failure, and we're just gonna celebrate the failure itself because of course it's okay to celebrate. It's okay for us to have a failures because it's our way to go there, somewhere like that, something like that. And we're gonna have 4 speakers for today, and the ticket is still available right now. So if you want to get it, you still can get it at the front desk for 75K. Because if you go at the door, I'm not sure if you can get in because the last one is like very packed. So I recommend you to get the tickets right now, so at least you can book your spot. And yeah, for tomorrow we're gonna have members lunch, Ubud members lunch. So we're gonna invite some caterer to bring some food here to Ubud. I'm gonna set up the place outside at the garden for 20%. So if you're interested, please send me an email. It's all on our Facebook page, basically. So you can just check it there, so I can book a spot for you. And on Saturday as well, we're gonna have a Ubud excursion. So we're going to West Bali. And basically, we're gonna see how the farmer, farming the rice paddies, and how to cook the Balinese food and anything like that. So the cost for that one is 670,000, but most of the cost will goes to the local business, so they can help grow the business as well and at the village. And also, it's already included with the lunch, transportation. So you don't have to be worried about that. So you just go and bring your stuff. That's it. So if you're interested for the excursion this Saturday, please let me know by today so I can book the spot because it's very limited. And yeah, for right now, I'm gonna present you Sandy.
Yay! Thank you. Thanks. Is this little thing okay? The microphone? Perfect. Cool. Okay. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Sandy. I don't actually live in Ubud. I've only been here for less than a week actually, but I'm super excited to be here. So I live in Malmö in southern Sweden and have been in Malmö for the past 18 months. Prior to that, I was in London for almost 10 years. And I've been working with startup PR for the past sort of 5 years and love it. So I just wanted to talk to you a bit about what it is and how you can go about it and how it can help you get your story out there. So can everyone see this? Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Thanks, Mickey. So this is what we'll cover today. It looks like there's quite a lot. By time there, it should take no more than 50 minutes, so do not fear. So first of all, PR. Like, what do you mean PR? What is PR? So I've worked in quite a few different markets, and I find that a lot of different people have different understandings of what PR is. So in the US and in the UK, PR is a very well-developed discipline, whereas in Sweden, when people say PR, they essentially mean information, which was a huge culture clash when I moved back home. Then we look at a day in the life of a tech journalist, just to give you a bit of an idea of how flooded they are with requests and emails and stuff every single day. And I mean, we're all at that point really, but I think that journalists are more so than anyone else. And this is important to just set the scene so that you get an understanding of why it's important that you curate your stories when you pitch journalists. And then we'll look at the golden rule of PR and its guiding principles. And this is all really sort of setting the scene, and this is the actual sort of, talk. So this is how you build your first press office. So I try to avoid buzzwords to whatever extent possible, and like press office might not mean very much to someone who doesn't work in PR. But what this essentially is a folder on your laptop in which you'll have a couple of documents that will help you get journalist interests. And a press office, depending on how many markets you operate in and how many target groups you want to get to, it can be however big. But because you're probably not PRs yourselves and you have other things to do, it'll just be a very sort of top-line press office. Then we look at how to secure coverage, which is obviously the core of it all. And then we'll look at a case study of how I went about pitching one of my clients. So I actually work at a startup house, not entirely different to Hubud, but I also do a bit of freelance on the side. So we'll look at one of my clients, how I went about pitching their story, and what the results of that was. And then obviously, because I hate going to talks myself, when you leave and you're like, okay, so what actually just happened? What the fuck can I do with this? I'll also just give you a couple of things that you can do as soon as you get out of here today. And then we'll have a nice little summary at the end. I also just want to say, so I know that you said on the Facebook page that we'll look at a press release, but after speaking to people at Hubud, I figured that a press release is probably not what most of you need. So press releases look at breaking news. And if you're a freelancer, if you have a digital business, you're very unlikely to have breaking news. What you need is to pitch your story as opposed to hardcore news. I also just want to say something about influencers. As you can see, they're not really on here. So PR is obviously earned media, it's third-party validation. And that's opposed to owned media or bought media. And the interesting thing with influencers is that they both earned and bought media. So they're somewhere in the borderline of that. So everything that we go through here in terms of how you're pitching journalists, you can also do, that applies to influencers as well, only you're going to have to pay a bit of a fee as well if they're, you know, professional influencers. Any questions? Already out of breath. That's great. Cool. Okay, so PR, what is PR? PR is reputation management. So you can think of PR as a sort of umbrella. So whether you do crisis communications or whether you're pushing your story out there, what you're doing is that you're managing a reputation. The reputation of yourself, maybe, as a spokesperson, or if you're trying to establish yourself as a thought leader, an expert within the field that you operate in, or if you are you're obviously managing the reputation of your company and whatever it is you're doing. So there are a number of things you can say that PR is, but to me, the core of PR really is reputation management. It's also storytelling. So doing PR, I mean, we're asking somebody else to write about us, and that's not information. It's about telling a story. PR, I mean, all means of communications really, that is brand building, is built on conflicts. You're telling a story. We were here and we're going there. And why are we doing that? That is what you want to sort of get out when you do your PR. It's also a super powerful way to shape public opinion if you do it well. So I used to work, one of my first jobs in PR was at TransferWise, which some of you might know. So they do international money transfers, the unsexiest product on the planet. So how do you make that interesting? How do you make it sexy? Well, you talk about the issues that are at hand. So for TransferWise, it was showing that the banks have been ripping consumers off by charging them hidden fees for centuries, well, decades on end. And that is a really powerful, like that story is a really powerful way to shape a public opinion, as opposed to saying, we do foreign exchange, because, I mean, who gives a fuck, to be honest. So PR is not a way to churn out information. Like, we get information all the time, everywhere, from everyone, and people are, I mean, I'm sure you know yourselves, we're just sick of information, we don't want any. What people want are stories, and that's what PR is. It's also not something you magically get, and I'm sure this doesn't apply to you, but I've worked with about 50 startups, and a lot of founders are just like, people will love me. Like, regardless of what I do, people will just write about me because my story is that good. Well, actually, you have to tighten your messages quite a bit to get people interested, precisely because people are, and particularly journalists, are bombarded with information all the time. It's not something you're entitled to. So again, PR is earned media. And this obviously, I mean, this all taps into one another. So you're not entitled to PR. The fact that you exist is not a story. And that's something to be, that's something that's important to be aware of. And I know that this sounds all sort of like gloomy. I asked Kirsty if she could go through the presentation. I was like, do I sound like a bit of a dick? Because it's all like, it's not this, it's not this. But PR is really fun, and it's a great way to get out there and talk about yourselves. But it's just important to be aware of these things. So, a day in the life of a tech journo. So, incoming, emails, texts, voice calls, people adding them on Skype, Facebook messages, Twitter replies, Twitter DMs, and then face-to-face. So this was written by Mike Butcher, who is the editor-at-large at TechCrunch, the world's biggest tech blog, which has now been turned into an online tech magazine, I suppose. So this is an average day for him, and this is what he needs to do. So he needs to get 3 to 5 news stories done by 9 a.m. so that they can go online. Then he's tinkering with 4 to 5 feature ideas on a daily basis. I mean, hopefully not 4 to 5 new ones every day, but nevertheless. He also does write-ups from trips because he travels a lot for work, and because he's not a CEO of like well-funded startup, he also needs to arrange his own travel and his own meetings because he doesn't have an executive assistant. And also, you know, just daily incoming crap, sort of like admin stuff. And why is this important? Well, to me, I think it just sort of paints a picture of how busy journalists are and what they're dealing with on a daily basis. So a friend of mine used to work at The Telegraph, which is one of the biggest national newspapers in Britain. She went on 2 weeks of annual leave and came back and had 55,000 unread emails in her inbox. So that is like, I mean, obviously, what do you do? Well, you don't. You just move, you just start from scratch. So that's just important to be aware of. So you know, I mean, I don't know if you're on Tinder, but if you are, if you have been, you might know how long it takes you to decide to swipe left or right. That's basically how long it takes for a journalist to decide whether they're going to cover you or not. So based on your pitch. So it's just really important to be aware of this and to know that the way you actually boil down your story and then turn that into a pitch will actually determine whether they're going to cover you or not. So the golden rule of PR based on all of this is don't be a dick. And I know that that sounds really obvious, like we're all nice people, we're all, you know, yeah, well, nice. So I do understand that we have to quantify this a bit. So what does not being a dick look like? So be respectful of people's time and remember the inbox. So don't chase them if you, I mean, do chase them because you'll have to, but don't chase them after like 2 hours because they probably don't even know that you exist yet. Be respectful of people's professions and interests. So when I worked at TransferWise, there's no point in me pitching the transport editor at The Guardian because the transport editor isn't going to care about the foreign exchange unless the pitch is like, well, so how about if you want to buy a really exclusive car that is only available in Germany and you live in Britain? Well, then that is super interesting, particularly if it's a car that's just been released or whatever, so that there's a clear news angle as well. So just look people up and see what they're interested in, what do they write about, and how can you fit your story into that. And also be respectful of the current news agenda. So if there's just been a Brexit vote in Britain, don't call a journalist and talk about, I mean, I don't know, food, unless it's like, okay, this is how the food industry, this like niche part of the food industry is going to be affected by the Brexit vote. And it's the same thing with like, so there was recently a shooting in Florida. I mean, like everyone's going to be super busy covering this. So don't pitch a journalist unless you work with counseling. And you can then email a journalist and say, I've been doing this for X, Y, Z years. And this is like based on my research and my experience and my clients. These are ways that communities can help each other in times of crisis of this sort of magnitude. So be respectful of the current news agenda and try to find ways to fit yourself into the current agenda. Any questions? Yeah, cool. Okay, so that was setting the scene. That was all the angry stuff. Now it's all fun from here. So building your first very light touch press office. Away with all the buzzwords. This is the stuff you need to get journalists' attention. So, and yeah, I also want to say, you're basically already doing this. This is just from a PR perspective. I mean, if you as an entrepreneur don't know who you're talking to, you're probably pretty screwed anyway. So you just need to know who are you talking to, and then ultimately figure out what sort of media they consume. So at TransferWise, we obviously spoke to a wide range of people. We had international students, we had expats, we had overseas retirees, we had people who wanted to get married abroad. I mean, everyone who's sending money abroad. That's a lot of people. So how do you find them? I mean, to most of you guys, I don't think that you need to look at your top tier customer. And then further down the line, you can look at your second and third tier. But because you're not focusing on PR to 100%, just find your core audience and try to figure out where are they? Like, so go to your customers where they are. And this is not just with regards to PR, but it's also with regards to your sales and all the rest of it. So yeah, find out what media they consume, what do they watch, and what do they read, and who do they follow on Instagram? Yes?
Do you have any like explicit direction as to how to find out that information?
So on Instagram,
Especially like what media they're consuming, other than talking to your target, is there any other way to?
Yeah, so that doesn't really scale unless you have some sort of platform where you can do that. But I think it's so the way we usually do it is that, like, when we develop our core audience in general, it's just that or our marketing persona is that we actually write down like a person. So for instance, I did a pitch for Oatly, which some of you might know. So who is Oatly? So Oatly is oat-based dairy alternative. So who's the target client? Well, Kirsty. So Kirsty is vegan. She was in the pitch. Kirsty's vegan, she lives in Bali, and it's just like thinking about why would anyone want my product, and yeah, who would want my product and why?
It's like my mum and dad. You're making assumptions basically, like on what you think kind of media they're assuming based on the person you.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're not like really concrete.
So.
Research.
I mean, you can quantify it, but quite often you have to pay for that sort of data. Okay. So obviously, every outlet that's online, i.e., every outlet, will have data on who follows them and who their demographic is. But so with their Mail Online, for instance, they have 200 million readers a month, regardless of who your target customer is. They're likely to be there, or they're likely to know someone who is there. But in the case of, that's why Instagram is phenomenal, because you can just search for hashtags, and then you'll find the people who use and follow the hashtags, and then you can see what sort of person they are and what are they likely to read. But it's a really good question, because there's no really right or wrong.
Trying to figure this out too. That's why.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so figure out what media they consume. Super easy. And then what you do is you find the gatekeepers. And in terms of this is, in terms of PR, this is your first media database. And it can look something like the next slide. And before we go to the next slide, it's this. So the gatekeepers, who writes about your field? And why do they write about it? And what do they tweet about? What makes them tick? And how, like, crucially, how can you fit your story into whatever they're writing about? And obviously here, Google is your friend or best mate for life. And I mean, I wouldn't encourage anyone to like Facebook stalk journalists, but I do it all the time. And I mean, maybe I wouldn't write in a pitch, so happy to hear that your son is out of the hospital, because that's just a bit weird. But it's just good to know what is likely to be top of their mind, because then they become more human to you as well. And you need to research every single journalist before you pitch them, because otherwise you won't know whether they are more or less likely to be adaptive towards what you're telling them. So this is what an example of a media database could look like for TransferWise. I mean, the media list for TransferWise had literally thousands of publications on them, and we wouldn't do personalized pitches for thousands of journalists, but we would do personalized pitches for the top tiers, so the nationals. And then we would also have verticals. So verticals are outlets that write about a single niche issue. And then I put in some influencers also, including Kirsty, who's going to have to up her reach on Instagram by like 19,000. But I'm sure you get there. So, so this is just like a very brief example of a media database, which is super easy to do. I mean, it's just a spreadsheet. So this is like, okay, so who are the people that write about stuff that we're interested in? Where do they write about it? And then their email. I mean, you can find, there's several websites online where you can just type in, this is the company where I want to email someone, and they'll tell you their email sort of format. So you can just lift it from there. And then the Twitter handle, I mean, it doesn't have to be Twitter, it can be Instagram or whatever, wherever they're the most active, so you get a sort of understanding of who they are and what they like doing and what makes them tick and all the rest of that. And then the reach, I mean, 200 million versus 35 million, regardless, it's a huge number. But this is still just to give you an idea of where's the low-hanging fruit, where's the highest return on investment, who should we target as soon as possible to get the biggest reach as soon as possible. And then this, in my opinion, is almost the most important bit, because this shows exactly why they're important for us. So they've previously written a feature on foreign exchange for overseas retirees. Don't pitch a journalist something they've already written, because they've already written it. They don't want to write it again. But because Jessica has done this, it's quite likely that she would want to do a similar thing on overseas students, for instance. And when you do a pitch like that, don't just pitch your foreign exchange startup. Include something else as well. Maybe in fact, this student money manager site. So students can use this site as well. And then that shows that you're not just selling your own product and service continuously. And it also, in that email with Jessica, would begin to establish you as a thought leader and shows that you really know your space. And yes, it has written to-dos. So if there are, quite often you'll see in newspapers that there are slots, and the most obvious ones are perhaps like agony aunt and all the rest of that sort of thing. But there's also like case studies of this is what I did when I moved abroad, or this is what I did, this is how I set up my own business, and so on. And try to find ways, because those are really easy slots to sort of fit content into. And this is actually a life or work hack by journalists and editors, because they have so much to do, right? Remember the inbox. So they know that if they have those sort of slots, people will just pitch them for those slots and they can just fill it with content. Yeah, and then also check like, is there anyone like you might know? So if you have a user database, for instance, try to include a little free text where they can write about how they're using their product or why they're using your product or service. And also think about any customers and clients you know love your service, and if you can use them as a case study. But if there are any journalists or like bloggers or influencers that are already using your service, that might be a very good way in.
Is it relatively easy to find their names of the journalists?
Super easy.
Okay.
So it almost always says who's written it. In articles and stuff. Or is that what you meant? Yeah. So and that's just, I mean, it's literally, so if you work, if you do financial services, for instance, you can just go onto the Telegraph and type in money, or like type in the your competitor's name and see who's written about this field, and then you find them on Twitter, and then so it's a bit of stalking, but I mean, this is the 21st century, we're all used to that, so yeah. Cool, back to the press office. So develop your story. And I mean, you've already done this. So every time you speak to a customer or a client or your parents about your company, that is your story. That is what you should just probably tighten a bit and think about how can you make this super compelling in just one sentence. So use the 5 W's. I had to write them down because I always forget one. So what, who, why, where, when. These should all be, these questions, as it were, should all be answered in like 1 to 2 sentences of like your service or your company or what it is you're trying to do. And it looks, perhaps, I don't know, but I can imagine that it looks quite like, well, how? That's a lot of information to fit into just 1 sentence. But I'll show you exactly how later. And one thing to remember about your story as well, you should demonstrate why you're the best person to talk about the issue at hand. So, I mean, yeah, if I said that I'm going to build a tunnel from Ubud to Jakarta, people would be like, fuck off. If Elon Musk said, I'm going to build a tunnel from Ubud to Jakarta, people would be like, fucking hell, there's going to be a tunnel between Ubud and Jakarta. So it's like, in your story, you need to show why are you the best person to talk about this issue. And even if you're not, like your story should say that you are, but it should show, not tell, which we get to right now. So building your stats bank, stats for statistics. So this sounds super intense. So at TransferWise we had 50 pages on all kinds of information, like numbers about foreign exchange and how many people transfer money and how much money they transfer and how big the market is in different ways. Like for you probably, depending on where you are in your business journey, you probably just need like 5, 7, 10 pieces of stats that show why your product or why your service is needed and to whom. And that should be fit into the 5 W's as well. So PR is storytelling, and it's best built around the principle show, don't tell, because we don't like being told what to do, told what to think. But if in the case of TransferWise, if we say, oh, we do foreign exchange, people are like, okay, well, give much of a fuck. Whereas if it's like, okay, so we looked at how much money was lost in 1 year by UK consumers when they transferred money abroad. It was £5.7 billion. I mean, there's 80 million people in the UK. It's not that much money per person, but £7 billion. That is a super compelling figure because it just goes to show that, wow, we're being fundamentally screwed by the banks. So that is like when you look at numbers, inflate that number is what we always say in PR. So how can you make this important to, like, so I'm a political scientist by training, so I'm always like, how can it affect the economy? How can it affect like the number of jobs? If you do counseling, how many people live with depression? Well, I mean, more than 300 million. That's a huge number. What if all those people were healthy individuals who could, you know, work and pay taxes? And I mean, like, if you in the travel business, how is the travel industry changing? And how can you inflate that number to paint a really compelling story?
Can you just clarify what you mean by inflate?
Make bigger.
But you don't mean lie.
No.
20,000 and make it 200. But just saying like.
I know what you mean, but I'm just trying to
Oh,
clarify.
right. Yeah. So for instance, if we say that, so with the TransferWise story, the 5.7 billion pound number, that was basically, okay, so the average Brit transfers to, I mean, I'm not a mathematician, so don't quote me on this, but essentially every Brit is transferring on average £200 a year. And if you look at the average fee that the banks say this is what being transferred versus this is what they're actually being charged, sorry, not transferred, what is the difference of that? And when you times that by 80 million, because that's how many people are in Britain, you get 5.7 billion pounds.
So basically, as opposed to saying everyone's losing £3 a year,
Yeah.
times it by the
Exactly. Yeah. So I used to work at another financial technology startup called Osper, which does prepaid debit cards for kids. And we did a study on how much money is being lost, how much change, like Christmas change, is being lost when people get money as Christmas presents. And I mean, that was like 250 million pounds that are on vouchers and checks. Brits still use checks because it's like a developing country, essentially. But anyway, so that number was so insane that the Telegraph was even like, we don't believe this. Like, how did you get this number? We did get some coverage on it in the end because, I mean, like, it's just a bit insane. So inflate that number and try to figure out interesting ways of how you can do it. And also, obviously, you need credible sources. Any other questions?
I love that.
Inflate that number.
Well, no, even just the stats, like it's kind of just like statistics is so.
And I think when you start reading the newspaper, so this isn't actually in a presentation, but if you read the newspaper, obviously there aren't many, like we don't have top tier international newspapers at your local newsstand here, but if you go online even, you can see, like, look at the makeup of a newspaper. So where are the different slots that you can pitch to, but also look at different articles, like what has been pitched here, like the statistics. There's always statistics that's been pitched. Who's the spokesperson? That person hasn't been called up by the journalist. That person or their PR has called the journalist. What are they trying to do here? They're trying to shape public opinion. And once you see that, you can never look at a newspaper the same way ever again. So yeah, how to secure coverage. And this is basically just summing up what we've said. So the fact that you exist is not news. What's the story? And why should whom care? So a couple of don'ts and do's, because we like to end on a positive note. So don't send the same generic pitch and press release to every journalist. So remember that you need to personalize when you pitch someone, and you want them to feel special and like you've actually done your research. And in the best of worlds, if journalists feel that, oh my God, this person just did my job for me, then you're set. Don't cold email journalists with no personalization. I mean, you could compare this to going out to the street and being like, do you want this? Because we all hate when that happens, and we're like, no, I don't want this. But if you can be like, I can see that you're wearing those sort of shoes, and I saw that you were walking from that cafe where they've only got vegan food, so maybe you want these vegan shoes. That was a really shit example I just came up with. But it's like personalized, essentially. Don't send loads of paragraphs of stuff that no one cares about. And I know that this sounds really harsh because we want to feel special and that everyone cares about what we do. But there's just so much information inflow from everything and everyone that like strip away all the jargon and no buzzwords, just be really succinct and really sort of think about how you can boil down what it is you're trying to do with your service beyond making money. Don't send a press release as an attachment, because we never open attachments. And also, this is really important, don't expect an immediate reply. And remember the inbox here, 55,000 unread emails. So if you don't get a reply, well, yeah, what were you expecting? You're going to have to chase. And it's why if you're going to do a big international announcement, if you start working with someone people actually care about, like Richard Branson, like what do I know, then and you do that as a big wide push, you're going to have to give yourself at least 6 weeks from when you write the press release to when you expect the coverage to be live, because you'll need to chase the journalist. And actually the example we're going to look at in a bit, I had to chase them for like 4 weeks before the coverage was published. So do be human, create relationships before you need to pitch. And this can be a bit tricky if you live in Bali and you can't really go to all the events that top tier international journalists go to. But we have social media these days. So, I mean, I'm not a natural tweeter myself. I find it all a bit anxiety-inducing. But nevertheless, if you're on Twitter, engage with your community, and your journalists will be in that community as well. When they tweet about things, make sure that you engage in the conversation if it feels natural. Like, obviously, don't force yourself to do it. But Twitter, in particular, is also a really good way of just seeing when journalists are asking for stuff, because they need spokespeople as well. And if you follow journalists that write about the sort of stuff that you do, then when they come out with a journal request and they need a quote from a spokesperson, if you're really quick, that could be a really easy way in for you. So yeah, curate media lists. Who should you target and why? And that's obviously not just for publications, but it goes for journalists as well. Always demonstrate why their readers will care and why anyone would care, really. That isn't just your mates or your parents. And when you write the pitch, it's not just about not doing paragraphs of stuff. It's also to actually bullet point, because we all know what it's like when we get a really long TLDR and we're just like, okay, we can't really be asked with this at all. So if you bullet point your personalized pitch, your hit rate is likely to be higher. So yeah, leave 2 to 3 days before you follow up, and expect to have to follow up a couple of times. And I don't know if this is a culture thing, but everyone's like, okay, just leave, in my experience, leave 2 to 3 days. We know that they're not going to get back to us, even if they love this story, because they are currently being chased by people who have already left 2 to 3 days and have done that for some time. Whereas in Sweden, people are like, this journalist didn't get back to me. And I was like, no, of course they didn't. What do you mean? So I suppose it depends a bit on the context and country you're in. But do expect to have to leave a couple of days before you chase them. Also, we all know what it's like to get an email at 9 and then someone's chasing us at 3 and you're like, fuck off, I've got stuff to do. So just looking at a case study of pitching. So this was a client of mine. So they are a medtech startup. They have developed an entirely new way to treat depression free of medication. And they, at this point, they had raised no money, or like very little, maybe like £15,000, so basically nothing. And what they wanted to do was that they wanted international coverage, because that is third-party validation. It also fuels their sort of SEO juice. So if you're being searched on, you want international coverage, because then people will be like, oh, this is amazing. So this was a way for them to get noticed by investors. So this is the pitch I put together for them. I pitched Business Insider, and this is actually quite a long pitch. The reason why it is long is because there's no actual news here. And you can't pitch a journalist, really, if you don't have any news. Like what are you telling them? We exist? Like I said, that's not something, like, people don't care. So the way to go about that is showing what is new, even though there aren't any breaking news. So I've broken down the pitch for us. So this is the most important thing in the pitch, some would say, including myself, because it's the first thing that journalists see when of your email. So if you just put, I mean, if this just came, just Swedish startup, mergers, brain stimulation, blah, 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 you could think that it's a newsletter. That is like someone else has already written about this, because it's built as a headline. So writing feature idea goes straight to say, this is what I want you to do with this. Like, it's a clear directive and indication or an instruction of what I want the journalist to do. So this also, like I said, it looks like a headline because our job, ironically, is to do the journalist job. We want to make it as easy as possible for them to just like copy paste. Like this looks great. Swedish medtech startup merges brain stimulation with wearable tech to wipe out depression. Are you fucking kidding me? That's insane. So yeah, great. Moving on. I've met this person before, but even if I hadn't met him, I wouldn't write "Hope all is well" because, I mean, who says that to a stranger? So I would just be like, "Hi Tom, I'm emailing with a story I think your readers could be interested in. I know that Tom has written about tech for several years. He covers early stage startups. I don't have to say this to him, show, don't tell, but just saying, I think your readers could be interested in this. That's all it takes to show that you've done your research. If I'd emailed this to like a personal finance journalist, they'd be like, what have you smoked? Like, why would I be interested in this? Like, no. So that's all it takes to just show that you've done your research. And then this is the one sentence summing up the entire story. Swedish startup Flow Neuroscience has built new wearable technology to upend the treatment of the world's leading cause of disability, depression. So remember the 5 W's. They're covered in all of this. So where, Sweden, who, Flow, what, built new wearable technology, why, to treat the world's leading cause of disability. Did I miss a W? When, yes, new, now. So, I mean, that's all it takes. So I know it can sound quite intimidating and overwhelming that you need to get all that in there in just one sentence, but it's fully possible. This is, I mean, this is quite tight, if you don't mind me saying so, because it's like a line and a half, essentially. And then just run down below. So here are the bullet points. So, so this is the Elon Musk, founded by a neuroscientist and a clinical psychologist. I mean, if I'd been like, I'm a PR, I've developed this wearable technology, that would be quite interesting, because how did that happen? But it wouldn't be very believable. Whereas this company has been founded by a neuroscientist and a clinical psychologist who have then, I mean, they've got the credibility to actually do this. And it also completely free from medication. This shows what's new. Yeah, entirely way to combat depression, completely free from medication. Clearly showing the journalist that this is new, even though there's no breaking news angle here. It's not like a new feature, but it is an entirely new product to address a really big issue. Yeah, exactly. If you can find any names that are like people like, wow, interesting. So Harvard and Oxford, like 2 of the world's most famous higher education institutions, if you can add that to your pitch, or if you can add, if you used to work at a really famous company, or if you're behind, like what is interesting about your story? How can you pick that out to give some more credibility and some more legitimacy to what it is you're trying to do, and then ultimately your pitch. And yeah, this tapping into a market of 300 million people. I mean, that's so many people. That's almost all of the US. And this number is also rising, actually. Fewer than half of whom receive treatment. So this really goes to show, if this is successful, it's going to be fucking huge. And obviously, the journalist want to get in early on a story. So yeah, tapping into a market of 300 million people. And then also, okay, so why would anyone care about that if they're not affected themselves? Well, it's also the leading cause of death for people aged 15 to 29 with HWO. So another, like, this is the source essentially, which is not like, oh, my nan said like this. So WHO estimating that 1 suicide is committed every 40 seconds. So that has like the wow factor, like, or to me at least when I read that, I was like, wow, I cannot believe that. That is insane. And if you feel like that, and you can run it by like a friend or something, then like it's likely that the journalists and their readers and their editors are going to feel the same way. And this, I mean, I do understand that not everyone is looking to end depression, but the point with this is that you too, regardless of what you're doing, your story is there. You just need to find the numbers that you can inflate so you can find the wow factor. And whether you do, you build websites, and you can look into, okay, so who want websites, and how is that field changing? Why are people moving to Ubud in like numbers never seen before? Well, to Ubud to set up their own businesses. What is this movement? How is it affecting national economies? Why is this happening, and why should people care? So, I mean, this wasn't here before they sort of went to a PR. That happened to be me. And I was like, okay, so what are the numbers that we can look at to make this really sort of interesting? And then this is just information. So this is the pitch, but the pitch needs to end with like, what do you want? Why are you writing to this journalist? Obviously, it's a feature idea, so we've already said sort of what we're thinking that he can do with this, but it's also what can you offer him? So, well, I can offer you this, a photo, great, and then if you'd like to speak to the founder. So if you have, I mean, you might be founders yourself, so if you can offer yourself and like perhaps some other thought leader in the space, then that's great, because that actually gives some flavor to the piece. And when you read articles and feature pieces, what you will see is that there's always quotes. And if you can use a case study, that's even better. I mean, so Flow Neuroscience isn't actually licensed yet, so they're not allowed to sell their product, which is why they can't use a case study. But a case study is always great, because a case study is, first of all, it paints a much better picture to the reader, but it also gives third-party validation on the other end of the spectrum. And if you can, like, so ideally, when Flow Neuroscience has been operating for a couple of years, people can be like, well, I took, one of their case studies could be, I took antidepressants and it affected my, all of them, I got depressed in other ways because my antidepressants maybe affected my sex life or my personal life in other ways. It changed my weight and so on and so on. So, and now with Flow, I don't get any of that because it's medication free. And that shows movement. It's like the conflict again, that we're going from X to Z using this product or this service. And then always end with a question. So, I don't know, I don't have any actual research or stats showing that it's true that if you end with a question, people are likely to get back to you. But anecdotally, like, because you haven't been a dick, right? Like, you've really been succinct and like you've done your research and you've written the story for them, they don't want to be a dick back, so they have to answer your question right. Oh, that's my hypothesis anyway. Any questions on the pitch?
No, I love it.
Good.
So did you get this?
Yes, so this is the results. So after 4 weeks of chasing, a Swedish startup wants to end the use of antidepressants with a head-mounted wearable. This is the wearable.
Wear that on your head?
Yeah, exactly. So not walking around always. So it's just for like half an hour a day or so, depending on your treatment needs. So this was their first piece of top-tier international coverage. It had a reach of 15 million people. And it's third-party validation, right? So like I said before, like when you now Google Flow Neuroscience, this is the first thing that comes up. And it built a track record with both potential customers and investors. And yeah, but so 4 weeks of chasing, and that is the shit thing about not having an actual like hardcore news angle. There's no embargo. Like, so the journalist is likely to have loads of embargoes and loads of like pressing actual real news. So they're likely to put you off even further than they would otherwise. But we finally got it, and the client was really happy. And then 3 months later, they managed to raise $1.1 million from a Silicon Valley-based VC, venture capital firm. Obviously not saying that this is only because of the coverage, but I do think that, I mean, when you have third-party validation, and because like when you pitch investors, I don't know if anyone here has pitched investors, but what you need to do, you need to show your market size potential and why this is important and why it's crucial that this happens right now. And that's the same thing that you do when you do PR. Like you show all the 5 Ws, and when a VC reads that, Kosla, I don't know if you know him, but he does a lot of medtech investments, but he only does later stages rounds. So the fact that he read this and was like, this sounds really interesting, he did it himself, it wasn't one of his partners, really goes to show that like PR, in this case, really worked. Yeah.
I have a question about your follow-up emails. So how do you word them?
So it depends. With Tom, I say, hi Tom, hope you're well. Just wanted to ping this back to the top of your inbox. Any interest, question mark. And then I'll do that after 2 to 3 days. And then if they don't get back to me, I call them. And if they don't pick up, I text them. Just tried calling you, would love it. I'll try call, it depends on the journalist as well. So after a while you get to know the journalists. But they know that until you've been given a no, you will continue to chase them. And I like to junior PRs, I think that is the thing that they find the hardest, that they have to chase. But if you don't, like, you're not going to get the coverage. That's just how it works. And if and when you do get a no, it's the most painful thing of my job. Because if you do your research and you think that this is such a good story, I would never pitch a story I don't believe in. So when you get a no, you need to ask why. Like, why? How could this have done better? Why don't you think your readers are going to care about this? And every time you interact with a journalist, that is a resource. So when you ask why, you can say, I'm surprised because considering that blah, 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 is blah, blah, blah important for this many people and your readers care about this, I really thought it would be a good fit. So yeah, just try and try to have that in mind as well. When you get rejection, that you want to, when you get back to them, that you want to push your case again. And sometimes they just say, we're too busy. Fair enough. I mean, they can be too busy. It can also be that they have, other stuff on the table is basically the same thing. But something happens in the news agenda that they can't, they're not in charge of. I mean, it can be a range of different things that aren't just that your pitch was bad. So I pitched The Guardian on the startup scene in Malmö, and The Guardian got back to me and said, we don't really write about startup scenes. We think the whole startup thing is a bit overhyped. And I was like, okay, well, that is really weird. And I don't agree. But, I mean, I can't really say that to a journalist. I say, okay, that's good to know. Thank you. So, what you can do today. You can find 5 journalists and influencers that you would like to target. And this is building your database, but it sounds less intimidating if you say find 5 journos. Follow them on Twitter, on Facebook if they have a semi-profile or public profile page, and get a better idea of who they are and why they'd want to care about you. And remember, because if you're all freelancers or if you're founders and whatever, there's no one being like, this has to fit into our quarterly plan. You can just like pitch, just write your story and pitch them. I mean, what's the worst thing that can happen? You're essentially starting from scratch anyway if you're really early stage. So just try and see what works. Start developing your story according to the principle show, don't tell. So remember that we don't like to be told what to do. We like stories, and we like to see change, and that really resonates with people. And then also start tinker with an idea for a pitch. So if you were to pitch someone, don't start writing a pitch until you know who you're going to pitch it to, because it will and it should change ever so slightly depending on the journalist you pitch and depending on the slot you're pitching for. But still, I mean, it's your story. Like, your story stays the same, although it's a bit fluid depending on who you're actually pitching. So in summary, these are the things I think you should remember. So PR is a perfect mix of arts and science. So like I just said, I mean, you have the format, like you have pictures, you have your story with the 5 Ws. And those are your tools. They stay the same. It's just the content, and that's the scientific part of it. And it's just the content, i.e. the arts. That's what changes when you pitch different people. Tell stories. Don't churn information. I've seen this so many times, and it's heartbreaking because your story is there, and you're doing what you're doing for a reason. Like you believe in what you do, and you just need to find how other people can believe that as well. And then don't be a dick. So, yeah, that is all.
Awesome.
Any questions?
That was great. That was awesome. That's not a question.
Good. Thank you so much. That's that's thanks in Swedish. I forgot to change it. Sorry, guys. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, exactly. It's just like.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So say you're just trying to target really big blogs.
Mm-hmm.
For me, one blog that I would want to target to maybe even just be a featured writer on. How do you go about doing that?
So, I mean, obviously there are several different ways of going about doing everything in life, and I understand that that's not very helpful to you. But so the most ideal way would be if you're already writing somewhere else. and you have a bit of a following, and you can say, I'll take this following with me, and there's some sort of like beneficial value. But if you're not writing, maybe you should ask yourself why you aren't writing yet, and why you're not writing on Medium or like some other platform that might be interesting to you, and build a following that way. But you can also just pitch them and say, I've been doing this for this many years, or I mean, like, you want to find what's interesting with you. It might not be the number of years you've done it. It might be the experience you have, or the journey you've made, or how you identified a gap in the market you operate in. So it's essentially just doing the same thing and showing. And also, I mean, if you want to pitch yourself as a contributor, I'm sure it's different for different platforms, but say I'd be willing, or I'd be able to write this many posts a week, and it would be on these different subjects. So you could have, I mean, when you do content development, it's often quite good to, or content marketing, it's often quite good to have 3 different sort of subjects. So one could be, if we take Kirsty, one could be like raw food, one could be yoga, and one could be digital nomadism. I don't know if that's a word, but for instance, so how do you go about moving abroad? Like, if you want to be a digital nomad, and how do you go about, because there's all, it's not called a hologram, but there's 3 circles, and then there's a circle in the middle, and that's you, and you tick into all 3 of them, and that's a little package you can present to this platform.
Okay.
I don't know, is that useful?
Yeah, that was useful.
Good.
I love it. I think it's even good for just even in writing emails.
Yeah, that is, I mean, you could do another.
For like calls to action and kind of giving that. Yeah, I like that whole structure. It's great.
Good.
I would like to know from your PR perspective, what are the biggest benefits and also the bad sides to have a big media coverage?
That's a really good question, and quite a funny one actually. So a lot of people say that there's no such thing as bad PR, which is complete bullshit. Like, there's lots of stuff that is bad PR. And one main thing you need to think about when you do a big push. So Flo wanted a feature piece in New York Times, and I said, there's no way you're ready for that, because when you get a feature piece in New York Times, it doesn't end there. You're going to get so many inbounds of like potential partners, obviously investors that you might not be interested in, and then there's also like, that's going to start a debate, and people are going to say, this is fucking bullshit, and do you have the manpower to actually deal with that? I would say no, because you've not been media trained, you don't have a PR, and I can't do it because I have a daytime job. So like, when you get, or when you secure coverage, if you're going to do it with a big publication like that, you need to make sure that you actually have some sort of plan of what happens after your coverage has gone live. The benefits of it, that is like the most touchy issue of PR, because it's really difficult to measure. So with digital newspapers, we can obviously see how many people have seen it, and we can track our website visits and all that. But what you can't track are those things that might be negative, like all the inbounds you get. That is really difficult to predict. You don't know who's going to pick up the newspaper that day. You don't know exactly who's going to read it and what actions they're going to take. But most of it is actually, I would say in my experience, it's really good, unless it's a negative piece of coverage. If it is a negative piece of coverage, the journalistic ethics code says that they have to reach out to a spokesperson from that company to give their side of the story. So that should give you some sort of a hunch if something bad is going to come. But because you're not Uber, I mean, that's unlikely to happen. Like, people don't want to like beat the crap out of small freelancers and companies that haven't really achieved anything that big yet. So that's not something to worry about until you get to a much later stage.
My question would be around pitching yourself versus actually hiring like a PR agent.
Yeah.
And what to maybe look for in hiring PR agents, because I've heard different stories about that too, where some people, they hire these agents, they pay them all this money, and then like to get results and things like that, it's difficult. But
so I work with early stage startups now, but I'm employed to do that. So I'm employed by the city of Malmö to coach startups on how to do their own PR. So if you're an early stage startup, you do not need a PR, unless in the case with Flow, they wanted a very specific piece of coverage.
Yeah.
But I am absolutely certain, and I've seen it so many times, that you can actually do it yourself.
Yeah.
And if you want to hire someone to get some help, try to find someone who can coach you so that it scales, so that you don't need to go to them every single time you want to do something new. Exactly. And never get an agency until you're much later stage, because agencies are super expensive, and it just drains money, and it can be quite, I mean, yeah, it's rarely good, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
You're saying yes, someone to coach you also then along with if you know any PR courses that are good for to do. I have a friend who did a PR course, and she got some really good results out of it because they're teaching methodology.
Yeah.
Do you know of any?
So I've never studied PR myself. I'm a political scientist by training. I don't think that you, as a PR professional, I don't think that you need to study PR, because you learn so much in the field. But if you want to do your own PR as an entrepreneur, I know that General Assembly has PR courses. I don't know if they're any good, but I mean, Google is your best mate for life. So maybe just Google it and see if there's anything out there. But I know General Assembly generally has a fairly good reputation, I think.
Maybe you could put a 4-week online training on PR for.
Oh God, that'd be interesting. Exactly. Maybe that's my new business idea. Yeah. Exactly.
Online marketing will get you
Exactly.
as a nomad and as a PR.
Yeah, that'd be so funny.
Shit, we've been filming Gilly.
Exactly.
There you go.
What would you say is the main differences between approaching a journalist and approaching an influencer on YouTube or Instagram or something?
So, as with everything in life, it depends. So it depends on who the journalist, is, and also where they work. So how big is the publication they work for? And it's the same thing with influencers. So I would say, generally, and in my experience, you can't, it's impossible. You can't just send PR samples to influencers anymore if they don't, perhaps if they have less than 5,000 followers, that might work, but still you then don't control the message unless you pitch them as well. So the biggest difference is that obviously influencers do not adhere to the journalistic ethics code, and also they charge you money to work with you. So that, but influencers, I think it's so interesting because they've come, it's been over the past 15 years since the first influencers started coming in Sweden, and Sweden was quite sophisticated quite early with the rise of influencers, and now they're building multi-million businesses off of their blogs. So one of the biggest influencers in Sweden, she charges £10,000 to just show up at a party, and she doesn't even promise that she's gonna actually write anything about the party. But there's a shift now where people have stopped, smaller brands they have stopped working with the bigger influencers because they charge so much money, and everything on their platform is being monetized constantly, so that their followers see them as celebrities as opposed to someone they can actually identify with and relate to. Exactly. So working with micro-influencers, people that have between maybe 1,500 even to 20,000 followers might be better, depending on how they engage and interact with their followers. Do they reply to their comments? What sort of brands do they normally work with? So that is, I would say that it's very different, but also in how influencers behave compared to journalists. But what we went through here today can still be applied to influencers, only you're likely to have to pay as well.
Financially worthwhile to go for that opposed to go for journalists? The amount of time
it's a good question. So I think with influencers, obviously what you can do is you can offer their readers something, so they get a discount or whatever. And if that relates, if the influencer thinks that that's going to have some added value to the readers, I think that could be great. I really do. And in terms of driving sales, it's also a way of shaping public opinion, working with influencers, if you shape and tighten your message and control it. So why should people care? But it's also a way of driving sales. It really is. So I would say yes. What's your question? A yes or no question? I don't know.
Cheaper?
Yeah, okay, so cheaper, cheaper in terms of money would be normal PR, unless you do it yourself, but it's cheaper in terms of time, and in terms of ROI might be influencers. Return on investment, sorry. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Anything else? Okay, cool. Thank you so much for having me.